Hello and welcome to Quiet RC. I'm Rob. Today we're going to talk about the Tamiya XV-02 Pro, and we're going to find out if the world's most complicated dust cover is effective. Spoiler, it's not very effective. It's not. Shh. As you can see, a questionably effective dust cover on the inside of this, but the actual build of the XV-02 Pro. Right off the bat, one of the first things you're doing is actually trying to dust-proof the car. Again, questionably effective. They have a separate sheet that they include with the instruction manual that will have a couple different steps on there that have the numbers that correspond to the step within the manual that you're kind of supposed to hop out of the manual, look at this on how to dust proof it at that specific spot. It has you do something that I've never personally done with a Tamiya or any other kit. That's not true. I did it with the Kyosho Phantom 2 kit. But with the Tamiya kit is gluing a couple of the lock nuts in there, which is weird because they're lock nuts. You shouldn't have to do that. But anyways, you have to kind of glue them in place. Otherwise, maybe you can't really hold them in place. I don't know. It was a while ago that I actually built this. Bunch of turnbuckles to do, which is nice that it has turnbuckles instead of just fixed, camber and everything like that. One trick that I use is actually putting that turnbuckle into the chuck of my drill. It helps. I still want to go slow. Otherwise, if you do it too fast, it builds up heat and you're kind of like melting the plastic essentially. As many of you may know, with the XV-02, it actually offers you two options when you're building the front and rear diffs. You can actually have different sized bevel gears, 39 tooth or 40 tooth. And what this does is it actually creates a little overdrive. If you want the overdrive in the rear, if you want the overdrive in the front, it can help you kick out the rear if you put the overdrive in the back, and it'll help you do a little more steering if you put the overdrive in the front. I opted to just go the 39 tooth front and rear just to keep it balanced. I'd like to say someday maybe I get into tuning and I do it, but I probably won't. I'll probably just mess around with it as it is. You'll need to use the corresponding bevel gear for when you're building the diffs, when you're actually building out where it actually goes in. It'll have a little mark on it corresponding with the tooth number that you're using for that bevel gear. So as you can see here, 39 tooth, even though it's clearly not a 39 tooth bevel gear, it just corresponds with that 39 tooth that you're using. As you're building the diffs, there are the little metal pins and it's very difficult. You have to be very precise. I had to use my very needle nose pliers to actually get in there and put them in place, but that's how you build the gear diffs in there. Putting together the diffs, finally, when you actually sandwich them all together and you have to put in the 4 screws per diff that actually hold it in place, it's kind of painful because it's really tight. And you do want to make sure you do kind of the same thing you do when you're tightening wheels on a real car, is you want to go in kind of a alternating pattern as you tighten them down, just so you're getting even pressure, torque on there when you put it together. One thing that happens in the instructions, and I've had this with other Tamiya kits, is you're looking at it and in the actual instructions, they are kind of constantly flipping your perspective or your view on the actual parts that you're putting together. So it's especially difficult when you're putting on like arms, or if you have a kit where the front and the rear are very symmetrical, so it looks all the same. So pay close attention to that. There's a couple places in this build where it's flipping just from one step to the next step, which perspective, and it's hard to kind of keep track of where the arms are supposed to be placed or what direction they're supposed to be placed. So keep sight of that because they do it a lot in this manual. There's a step where you're using 2 different pins and they're very close. They're like a millimeter difference. However, one is silver, one is black, and you can kind of see that in the instructions that one is silver, one is black. And those will depend, even though they're in the same step, you have to put them in a specific spot. So just keep an eye on that as well. For this particular vehicle, because it's not going racing or anything like that, I just wanted to try using one of the Castle motors that's kind of measured in kV. I'm usually used to racing motors where I'm, you know, doing a 17.5 turner or 21.5 or something like that. So I've never done the KV thing. So I had to kind of do a little bit of research on building something with a motor that's only measured in KV. So I had to learn about sizing and KVs and everything like that. I'm not going to go into it here because I'm not the expert on that yet. However, I'll put in the description the motor that I use for this, both the sizing and the KV, and also the Sidewinder ESC from Castle that I use. One of the things that's interesting, or a little frustrating to be honest with you, is when you're trying to set the gear mesh, because of the way it is mounted in there, you can only get to the very top motor mount screw. So what you're actually going to do is, or what I did, and I found best way to do it, is mount that aluminum motor mount in there. By the way, leave off the pad because it's better to have a little bit of that metal to metal contact to help dissipate some of the heat. Mount the motor onto the motor mount loosely with the pinion gear in place. Mount it into the car, and then set your mesh. And what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to tighten the top screw. So tighten that down nice and tight so it doesn't move. And then you're going to flip it over, take out the motor mount again, and then you can tighten that lower screw that actually screws into the motor itself, and then put it all back in. Double check your mesh to make sure it hasn't moved when you took it out. But that is really the only way I could figure out how to do it. One part that was kind of intimidating is as I emptied out one of the bags and saw that all the CVDs were unassembled and I was gonna have to put them together, I was not looking forward to it. However, even with all the little clips and the rings that you had to use, it was relatively simple. A little later in the video, you will see where I had some trouble with the CVDs after a run. Speaking of which, now's a good time to remind you, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. I have a bunch of projects coming up that I'm really excited to share with you guys. Even more fun than this was. So please subscribe, give it a like while you're at it. If by the end of the video you don't like it, you can always go back and dislike it. It's okay. Just subscribe because I have a lot of stuff coming up. Anyways, at this point in the build, you're on to the dampers and building dampers. They go together like every other oil-filled dampers. However, while they look the same and all the parts seem to be the same, when you're building the front and rear dampers, they are different because you will be putting extra O-rings inside of the damper of the front ones. And if you do that for the rear, you're going to come up short on O-rings when you're building the rest of it out. I believe you can use a regular size servo in this, but it'll just stick out above the dust cover. However, I used a low profile one. So if you're just going out and buying a servo specifically for your XV-02 Pro build, just go ahead and get a low profile one. And then you can kind of skip cutting out part of the dust cover. I cut it out just because it was in the instructions to cut it out, but in hindsight, I didn't need to cut it out. So it could provide just a little extra dust protection, but probably not, honestly. Now, when you're doing the battery and how the battery goes in there, and I'll show you here as well. Tamiya still lives in a world where everybody uses the old school Tamiya kind of rounded edge stick batteries. So while I understand what they're doing by keeping this nice and narrow, it does limit your choices for batteries. Now, I used, just because of what I had on hand and charge at the moment, I used a Shorty 2S LiPo, and I kind of had to fabricate a little bit of a spacer out of some extra foam, hard foam that I had laying around. So you could use it, and what's nice is with the dust protector on, this kind of holds closed, and it kept everything in there, even though I rolled this plenty of times, you know, kind of beat it up pretty well, and everything stayed in place. However, you know, probably just a regular 2S hard case LiPo will fit in here just fine. I had a kind of one of my racing full-size 2S stick LiPos. Obviously, they do sell LiPos that are shaped like old school Tamiya packs, but it would just kind of be nice if Tamiya would acknowledge that they don't live in a world anymore where people only have those, or only those stick type batteries exist. And on that note, one of the things in the instructions is they leave it up to you if you want to put an extra screw in here. Both of these can kind of flip open. I did the screw on this frontward one to hold it in place, And I left the screw off of this one so I can kind of slide it in there, close this, and then once you put the dust cover on, it does kind of hold everything in place. Again, I had a battery that didn't even kind of supposed to fit in here, and it still stayed in there even when I was rolling it. So there's not too much concern if you leave that particular screw out. It's not going to go flying everywhere, especially if you're using the dust cover. One thing I'm going to upgrade on here already is the wheel hexes. They're just the kind of standard plastic with a pin. The problem is if you go to take the wheel off and that plastic hex, wheel hex comes off, the pin's gonna drop out. So I would get those aluminum clamping ones, and Tamiya sells them. I think they're like 20 bucks for the pair, but you can find less expensive versions that even may have some offset options for you, online somewhere. So you can find those. Towards the end of the instructions as you're building this, you are going to get to the part where you're going to install the body posts. One thing about this kit that's a little interesting, and at the time when I was building it, I was a little frustrated by it, but turned out to not be such a big deal. The front body posts are mounted on the bumper, and as you can see, it's pretty flexible. And I was worried that this would kind of not hold the body in place. However, once you get the body on there, everything stays pretty rigid. For decades, Tamiya's had their body posts in exactly the same spot. As you can see, this is not a body that was designed for the XV-02. And while the rear ones are in the typical place, and this is pre-cut, the front ones that were pre-cut are in the wrong spot. So I had to put extra holes here. And the reason for that is when you put this body on here at the appropriate height, it really almost doesn't clear this shock tower. So it's really close because you do have large shocks, which is great for suspension travel for rally car chassis. So at first I was a little annoyed by it, but in reality, it really is how it should be. Now I have a old TA02 here. That body is a newer body and it fits just fine because they haven't moved the shock tower around for most of their cars. Speaking of which, again, don't forget to subscribe because I do have a video coming up on this Hot Shot 2 back here. Back to this car. Once you do all that, they're gonna have you assemble your dust cover, and it is really complicated to put together. There's a lot to it. To cut all these pieces out, I am using the score, and then you bend and snap.
Bend and snap.
I find that's much easier just on our hands because you're not constantly going at it with the scissors. There's a bunch of bolts that you have to put through. One thing that I did that was a little extra is I did use a little shoe goo, which is my favorite thing to use for a lot of reasons, in between these pieces, just as a little extra holder. Now, one thing I did was I reamed out all 3 holes, but actually you're only using 2 at each corner. But you do use 2 bolts and washers. Yeah, you use washers. Bolts, washers, and nuts. So these little things are not going anywhere. Now, when I put this body on, I actually had to trim these out here to be able to fit the body because this particular body does come in a little bit, which is nice because it's even tighter around here and it holds it, makes it more rigid around the sides. There is a little caveat too with using the dust cover, which again is nice, it looks great, is where these plastic pieces are on each corner, this will give you how high everything in the chassis has to be. So you really have to concentrate on your wire management to keep everything below this kind of plane right here. I actually went and cut the motor wires down so they're perfectly to length for what they need to be, as opposed to when you get it, they're really long. So cut those down. After running it, took it out, had a great time with it, got a bunch of great shots, went to a local park where we had some tarmac to dirt to off-road. And one thing that happened when I took it to a second location to run is one of the front CVDs kept popping out. Now, on full extension, this CVD is almost right at the edge. And I think once it popped out once and it kind of banged up the inside of this drive cup, it just kept happening. So I could get a little bit of run, but once I did a hard turn, it would pop out again. So I had to stop the run. I'm not entirely sure how I'm gonna fix it going forward at this point. I don't know if there are some aftermarket drive cups that I could use Now, Tamiya does put the millimeter length on the CVD, and these are 37 millimeter. Maybe somewhere out there's a 38 millimeter I can try and fit in there, because it does seem to have the room. Just looking at it, it looks like there's at least 2+ millimeters still left to move in there. So maybe we can do that. Anyways, that is the wrap up on the XV-02 Pro build. Enjoy some more run footage that I have here. And please remember to like this video if you do. More than anything though, subscribe. And feel free to comment below if you have anything that you've experienced with this, or have any questions about it, or some things that you think I could change up on this. I'd be more than willing to hear that. Until then, we'll talk RC later.